It's been quite a week. On Monday and Tuesday of this week, we hosted the Board of Ordained Ministry ordination interviews for persons coming for provisional and full membership as ordained elders and deacons in the United Methodist Church. Those folks came for interviews this week, but they'll be recommended to the executive session of the East Ohio Conference in May and then ordained at annual conference in June. Several dozen folks were here, people of all ages, I have to say, some young and just out of college or at least early in their seminary career, others more mature in age, and certainly nobody as mature as me, although there are plenty of folks on the board who are of a certain age. We were hosting close to 80 or 90 people here, part of that process this week, and we watched people come and go. There's a story in the Plain Dealer this morning about people auditioning for the Cleveland Institute of Music, students coming to study there. We saw some of those same anxieties here this week with some of our students preparing for ministry and hopefully being recommended for the same. Many of those were continued or were passed on, some were continued. We actually set up downstairs a coloring table. We are coloring Stations of the Cross that will hang actually on the second floor as part of our art display later on in the season. And several of the interviewees as well as some interviewers colored, and one at least told me how calming that was, how relaxing that was. So we're kind of glad we gave them that opportunity to do that. So early in the week, there was this celebration of newness of ministry, and then on Saturday evening, on Friday evening, Diane and I spent all day being trained in the intricacies of figuring out how to distribute your pension benefits. That was really exciting. And then in the evening, we were feted, as they say, with a beautiful meal at the Sheraton Suites in Cuyahoga Falls. Around 30 or 35 people are retiring this summer from ordained ministry, ordained and licensed ministry. And each of us was presented, as Paul Farron told me, with a clock. Paul got his clock, was it last year? And strangely enough, Paul is a retired pastor living here in Worcester. Strangely enough, the clock was stopped, so I don't know what that means. It doesn't work. Is there some meaning, David, in that? I don't know. And that, as I was sitting there, my name is close to the end in the alphabet, so I knew it would be a while before I would be called. I noted the number of years that people had served in the annual conference. As few as 10 or 15, or I think one was 17, but as many as 40 or 45, and I think the longest is 46. Diane, nearly 1,000 years collectively given in service to the work of the church in East Ohio. It was a fitting end to a week that began in ministry and ended with a celebration of the same. But I got 112 or so days left, and 10 or 12 minutes of a sermon to preach, so I should get on to it, don't you think? We were going to show you a video of the bishop thanking us and thanking the churches of this conference for their faithful payment of apportionments. I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment, but when we turned it on this morning, we had picture but no sound. So you can imagine her sitting there on the view screen saying, "Thank you, thank you, thank you." There's more to it than that, but I don't remember the rest of the script. Apportionments. Of all the institutional and theological elements that make up the United Methodist approach to Christianity, perhaps the oddest, one might even say the most foolish of them, is this thing called the apportionment system. It's through the voluntary payment of apportionments, monies that are measured and meted out to each congregation, collected by the general church and then placed in the general pot for the support of our common work in the world. It's through the voluntary payment of apportionments that United Methodists fund our mission and ministry, whether it's here locally in Worcester, in the Canal District, in the East Ohio Conference, or across the nation and around the world. Apportionments. Someone has said that you could divide that word up into 3 words, a portion meant, and understand it perhaps a little bit better. A portion meant for you. A portion meant for you. A portion meant for you. Apportionments allow us to pay our leaders, clergy and lay, adequate wages, good health care, fully funded pensions. You can imagine that I'm interested in that. Apportionment dollars come directly here to Worcester United Methodist Church by way of a grant given by the Canal District to support our Meals Together program, our Thursday evening meals on every Thursday evening here. And also come to the city of Akron and other large cities. Akron has an agency called Open M. It stands for Opportunity Park Ecumenical Neighborhood Ministry. They're celebrating their 50th year of ministry this year. They are funded through the conference apportionment system. The apportionment system allows us to be in ministry to people in Appalachia through the Redbird Missionary Conference in central Kentucky. Children and men and women as well have their health care needs cared for in northeast Liberia and other surrounding nations in Africa through the work of the Ganta United Methodist Hospital. Kay knows something about that program. Apportionment dollars are hard at work, along with the blood, sweat, and tears of volunteers at the Nehemiah Mission on the west side of Cleveland, where a team of youth and adults from Worcester will go once again this year, the week of June 25th, which happens to be the last week of my active United Methodist ministry. A team from our church will once again go to bring hope and wholeness to the residents of the Nehemiah Mission community and surrounding ones. And yet, apportionment for you, an apportionment for you, apportionments are voluntary. We can't be forced to pay them the way we are forced to pay our taxes. Sorry to bring that up. Deadline's coming up soon. Still, the Christians who gather here at Worcester United Methodist Church have been supportive of this apportionment system for decades, paying in full our portions meant for others through thick and thin, through rich and lean years. We were even able to accomplish the payment of our apportionments this past year in the face of what was perhaps the most difficult budget crisis to hit us in recent memory. We are among the churches, then, that Bishop Malone would have thanked if you would have seen the video a moment ago. Maybe we'll play it somewhere else where we know we have sound. We do this, we fund ministry in this way, and we support the funding of ministry in this way because we've been gathered together and called into being by a leader and a Lord who walked faithfully in the way of the cross, who is one who has called us as his followers, his disciples, to take up our own crosses, as Larry Black reminded us last week, to take up our own crosses and journey as he journeyed along the road that led him, even as it leads us, to Calvary, to the cross, to Golgotha, to the tomb, and to Easter that lies beyond. Only through death may we know new life. The Apostle Paul reminds us in the 1 Corinthian letter of the foolishness of that fact, of that faith. The message about the cross, he says, is moria. It's the Greek cognate for the word moronic. Writing his epistle, his letter, to a people whose church is riven with disunity, discord, and dissension, Paul advises his readers and hearers to find and found their unity, not in the values of the world, but in the ways and means of God, the one who chooses the lowly through which to communicate God's love for the world, God's care and concern for those who are overcome or overwhelmed, depressed, or downtrodden. As Carla Works, who's the associate professor of New Testament at the Wesley Theological Seminary in Washington, D.C., says, God chose the most shameful thing in the world because the values with which the world operates, where some have privilege and status at the expense of others, look nothing like God's reign. The Ten Commandments, then, provide us with a picture of the way God intends for human beings to live in this world that God created and called into being, a way of life that springs out of God's own identity, an identity which has been etched on our very hearts and souls, for we have been created in God's image. I am, God says at the beginning of the commandments, the Lord your God who brought you out of slavery in Egypt. God in this way is revealed as one who cares for the dispossessed and the downtrodden, for slaves and refugees, for the exiles in this or any day. Such a God of care expects us to care in return for those whom we live and laugh and love, with whom we live and laugh and love, those who are near and dear to us as well as those who are far away, those whom the world, whom we might rather reject. In a recent sermon, Walter Brueggemann, who is the preeminent biblical scholar of this 21st century in America, Walter Brueggemann calls the commandments God's guidelines for how we are to live emancipated. For we have been set free from Pharaoh, as the Hebrew people themselves were set free. We have been set free from whatever holds us back from living in the fullness of God's realm. The question is, how are we to stay free? How do we stay emancipated and avoid slipping back into Pharaoh's deathly grasp? I've characterized the Ten Commandments in this way before, as statements of behavior that set us apart from folks in the world, set the people who stand under the authority of the Ten Commandments apart from others. It's like I used to say when my kids were younger and testing out alternative behaviors, lying and cheating and cursing, and they would say to me, everybody else does those things, everybody else talks like that. I'd say, well, we're Tobiases, and as for us, we don't. As for you, God says in effect, in the commandments, you shall have no other gods before me. As for you, you shall not make wrongful use of the name. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. You know, as you were reading that, it struck me that it's not just human beings who are called to remember the Sabbath. The text says even the cattle are supposed to rest. God commanding rest, Sabbath rest, for the creatures under God's care, as well as for the human beings who care for them. As for you, you'll honor your father and mother. As for you, you shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness. You shall not covet anyone that belongs to your neighbor. As for us, as for you, as for me. Jesus summarizes the Ten Commandments too, and as he puts it, the rest of the law and the prophets, the whole of Scripture, the whole of God's self-revelation of God's self to humankind. Jesus summarizes these in a single sentence, one whose insights are themselves derived from ancient Israel, of which Jesus was clearly a part. You shall love the Lord your God, he says, with all your heart and soul and mind and strength, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Now, if you're getting tired of someone standing and saying, love is the core of the gospel, then start doing it, right? I'm not adjuring you, I'm not criticizing you, I'm criticizing myself. Jesus' message of love is core and key to the gospel, and yet we continue to be a people who are enslaved and enchained by Pharaoh. Jesus calls us to love God and nothing else in the world, nothing else that claims to be God. The scriptures call us to love others, to love our neighbor, rather than dehumanizing or enslaving or rejecting or turning them away. And Jesus commands that we love the self, ourselves, as beloved children of God. You, even me. Love stands at the core of our ethic, our behavior, and our identity. Love expressed in Jesus' willingness to take up the cross as he commands us to take up ours and walk in the way that leads to death and life. For Jews demand signs, and Greeks seek wisdom. But we proclaim Christ crucified. A stumbling block to Jews, foolishness to Gentiles. But to those who are the saved, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. For God's foolishness is wiser than human wisdom. And God's weakness is stronger than human strength. Offered up to you this day in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit.